can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so my name is Catherine Hanna. I'm one of the educational counselors with CEF, or Coptic Educational Foundation. Today I'm here to talk about ways to help your child succeed in education, but just out of curiosity, if we can show of hands, are your kids in kindergarten, like in elementary school? Middle? Elementary, middle and high school? Okay. So we have a mix. I have everything. Okay. Okay, then I'll talk about a little bit of everything, because I was just going to see if there's any more specific I can get. But okay, so we all signed in? So I'm Catherine Hanna. Some of you may have heard of Sandy. She's our other educational counselor. So either one of us are happy to answer any questions that you may have with education. And then I guess a little bit about me. So my background, I went to undergrad at UC Irvine. I double majored in psychology and social ecology. And then I did my master's at UCLA in higher education organizational change, really focusing on college access and things like that and how to prepare your child for college. And then I spent the last about 4 years working at USC, doing admissions, advising, counseling, all that good stuff. I recently transitioned out, but still within the education space. And I've been advising students and families for at least 8-9 years at this point. So if you have any questions, I have a wide range of knowledge. So for the agenda, I'll quickly review some of our services. We'll talk about a guide for parents, middle school success, it should say extracurricular activities, high school success, pathways to college. I'll touch a little bit on financial aid, and then any questions. So I'm really going to kind of walk through from elementary all the way to college. If you have any specific questions throughout, please feel free to just raise your hand. So for our services, we do have middle school services, high school, college, everything for middle school students. We do help support newcomers and undocumented families, as well as special education. We do some counseling and homework help. So homework help is, if you're interested in this, it's $200 for unlimited homework help for your students. They essentially get access to tutors, and typically I believe it costs about $1,000, so you can get it for $200. If you're interested in that, I can talk to you later a little bit more about it. For high school students, right now we do have our community involvement internships that we offer for students, one-on-one career counseling or college counseling. And then right now, if you know any seniors in high school, we do have our Merit Achievement Scholarship, which they can win up to $1,000 for scholarship for a 4-year university if they're accepted already. And then for college students, we do a lot of one-on-one for job search, resume, how to prepare for a job interview, graduate school application process. And right now as well, we have our PEAK Scholarship, which is anyone going to graduate school, so medical school, dental school, law school, master's, PhD, anything. We have up to a $2,000 scholarship for 5 students. So that application is actually going to be extended till May 31st. So if you know anyone for going to 4-year university or graduate school, we do have those 2 scholarships. Okay, so some general topics, and I think we can, we'll see how this goes. So choosing schools, private versus public, and this is more so for like K through 12, as well as kind of enrolling your children, school visits, all this good stuff. I'll get into it. So choosing a school, I think this is one thing that we often hear. It's parents are sometimes confused. Do they go public? Do they go private? What does that look like? How do you learn a little bit more about schools within your district? So here are some resources, and by the way, we can send this presentation after, so you don't have to write anything down. But if you wanted to learn about different public schools within your area, there's like the California School Dashboard, as well as if you want to see kind of the ranking of the school and the teachers and all that good stuff, there is a lot of information you can find online. So just sometimes even looking at these websites like the California Longitudinal Pupil Achievement Data System. So looking to see about the progress of the school and the rankings of the school. This is oftentimes where you can find a lot of that information.
Sorry, but you didn't get to the point of private versus public.
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So just a little bit more as you visit schools, both public and private, there's a lot of really key information that we encourage parents and families to really get to know. So first and foremost, as you choose a school, obviously getting to know the school, But part of that looks like getting to know the school calendar, understanding the school profile, and the profile is important, especially at the high school level, because that gives you information about where their students are going for college and what they're actually doing. And this information is all public, but oftentimes we don't realize it's there. Knowing who to contact at school, their secretaries, their teachers, as well as test dates, what type of activities are offered at the school, and if it's a good fit for your student, and then of course getting to know grades and information, homework systems, things like that. So a lot of that information is sometimes online, or you could talk to people like the principal, counselors, things like that. So public versus private. So the big difference, I think the number one difference is public is free, private costs a lot more money, and it can range, right? And with that being said, because public systems are funded by the government, there are certain rules that they have to abide to. So sometimes a curriculum they teach, the things that students have access to are all based off that. Whereas private schools, because they're relying on their money from you as someone who's going to pay tuition, they are not bound by the government to teach certain things. They can teach what they want. So that's why we see private schools being religiously affiliated, whereas public schools cannot be religiously affiliated. So that's one key difference. In terms of teachers, public schools, the teachers have to be certified. So they have to go through a California certification system to be able to teach your students. At a private school, they don't require that. But instead what they require sometimes, or what you'll see at the private schools, you'll see people with masters and even PhDs. Because they don't have to go through the certification system, private schools oftentimes are looking for people who are a little more educated in a specific area, whereas in the public school, as long as you have a certification, you can teach. So that's where the quality of education can sometimes vary. Private school essentially is going to have people that are more specialized in something and can teach a little better, whereas public, they have more general knowledge, but sometimes not very specific knowledge. So that's one key difference. I will say a lot of that also goes down to how well funded a school is. So some public schools in more wealthier areas might have really good systems and you don't have to pay for it. But again, depending on the area, and as you look at like the school ranking and things like that, you'll have a little more knowledge of what the teachers actually have and how qualified they actually are in certain subjects. And this is important because sometimes we see, or I've seen, a teacher who majored in biology teaching in a high school, teaching biology, chemistry, and physics. They're not very well versed in chemistry and physics, but they're able to teach it because they have their certificate. So whereas at a private school, you have someone who's majored in chemistry, maybe even a master's in chemistry, teaching chemistry. So that's oftentimes a big difference. For public versus private schools accept anyone within their district. So oftentimes wherever you live, there's an area of which schools you naturally go to because you live in that area. And some public schools sometimes accept what's called like school of choice. And I think there are other names in different districts, but essentially if you want to take your child to another school within the same district or outside of your district, you could apply for school of choice. And it's usually like a lottery in most cases. There are some public schools, I can just think of two right now, but they're a little more in like Orange County area, that require students to take an exam to be admitted. But typically public schools do not require any examinations. Private schools, on the other hand, some of them will require examinations and may even require you to align closely to their religious affiliation if they have one. So they are more selective, and typically, as you can imagine, a student going through the private school system oftentimes is a little more advanced because of who they've been taught by. So naturally, they're a little more competitive for some of the private schools. Not to say you can't jump between the two, you certainly can, but just be prepared for your student to take an exam. And some private schools too will actually publicize what they'll test your student on. So if you're gonna change routes, you can definitely prepare for that. And then, yeah, I mentioned the religious affiliation, so that's another big difference in terms of what can be taught and what cannot be taught. Any questions on that? Yes.
So lately, like most all schools around us here, the ranking have went down a big deal, even in the wealthiest areas. So what is affecting the ranking going down? Is it the state testing or other factors?
So I'm not familiar with this school district, but if you ask me, I think what we're seeing is a lot of teachers are leaving. And because we have less teachers, we have one person, before you had maybe one person teaching 60 kids, now you have two people teaching, or one person teaching 120 kids. So I think naturally a lot of the schools they're not equipped with teachers, so they're not giving attention to the students. And if they're not giving attention to the students aren't testing well. And I think that's not just here. We're seeing it a little more widespread. The solution to that, I don't know. We have to retain our teachers a little better. But it's not to say, so here's the thing too with high school rankings, because as we look at rankings, I think we look at how well your student's going to perform, what colleges they're going to get into. I think a lot of it really boils down to the student learns a certain amount of information at school, but it's also reinforced at home, at tutoring, other places. So you can only rely on the school so much, especially now, given what's happening. But as long as they're performing well and they're learning the information, they're doing well, it's okay. And I say that in the sense that ultimately it's where they're ranking in their classes. But I will say I've definitely heard and seen students in which they're not being challenged enough. And I think that can be an issue for some students, and you may want to look for another alternative that allows them to be more challenged. So that I can see happening. But yeah, the system is at a very interesting place right now, unfortunately, given everything post-COVID and all that. So I don't have an answer.
So does it make any difference when applying for any college if you are going to private or if you are coming from private versus public?
That's a really good question.
And like, how is he ranked? Like when I see CV, okay, was grad from private versus, I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So the way I see it sometimes is some public schools are really, really good. There's really no reason why not to go to them. I think for some private schools, and what I've seen, especially being like on the admission side of USC and things like that, there are certain schools that have relationships with private universities. And because they have these strong relationships, I tend to, and I've definitely seen that, like for instance, USC has some private schools within the LA area, they take a lot of their students because they have a relationship, because they know the curriculum very well, and because it's a private university and a private high school, they can teach and take who they want, right? Now, if you're looking on the public side of things though, like your UCs, UCLA, UC Berkeley, things like that, Cal States, they don't favor any one private versus public high school. I really only see the relationship benefit from private high school to private university. Does that make sense? Because they can make up their own rules. It sounds weird, but yeah, that's kind of how it works.
And do you have like ranking for private schools? Because I can go see ranking for public schools. I've never seen like ranking for private schools.
Yes, you can. The website is slipping my mind right now, but there is, and it should be maybe even the same one. Greatschools.org, you should be able to see the private school rankings as well.
They only score private and then you score public, but there is no list
Together? No. Because they're so different, in that case, they can't be on the same scale in a way. I think it just boils down to, do they have what you're looking for, what your student's looking for, extracurriculars, the type of curriculum that they're teaching. So I think that's kind of where you would have to go on the websites and kind of tease them apart. Yeah, there's no one central place. You kind of have to do the research on, in most cases, once you've identified the schools that are of options, and then you can really compare the two. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I came late. I'm not sure if you guys talked about this or not, but I have a question on the honor classes versus AP classes. And they're the same, or there's any difference between both of them, and also the influence the college decision in taking this student versus the other.
Yeah, so the difference between an honors and an AP class is that honors classes are just a little more advanced, a little more difficult. It's the same subject, but they're learning it a little more intensely. An AP course essentially is a college level course, so it's even a step up above that. I will say though, college counselors or like school counselors oftentimes will recommend a student, like for instance, freshman year of high school, they take a couple honors classes, and then by the time sophomore year, if they do well, they kind of have the confidence and trust to put them in AP classes. Not to say you have to take honors classes to take AP, but it's a good indicator that you're going to do well. Whereas if you're taking regular classes and you're not doing so well, a school counselor may be hesitant to put you in an AP class, because if you couldn't really keep up in a normal pace, how do they expect you to take it up? In terms of how colleges perceive it, though, so there's the unweighted and the weighted GPA that come into play. So the AP scores will be factored into the weighted GPA, making your GPA a lot higher. Colleges, though, will recalculate the GPA to make it on an unweighted scale, looking at that. But I think both classes have value. The key difference, too, is some high schools do not offer a lot of AP. Some high schools offer a lot of AP classes. So that's another thing you would look at as you're choosing your schools, too. Do they have a lot of AP classes that align with my students' interests? Do they not? And then colleges, they have all that information. So they know exactly how many AP classes are offered at that high school, exactly how many honors classes, and then they can compare how much the student benefited from that. So that's really what it comes down to. We're looking at the student given their environment in their high school. And that's really what it comes down to. So both are good. It just depends, again, what the school offers and how much the student took advantage of it. So
So the only being offered in high school, do you not offer honor classes in junior high?
some middle schools do. Yeah, some middle schools do. And I would encourage, if the school recommends your student takes those honor classes in middle school, I'd recommend to take them, because when they go to high school, they're going to look at their middle school transcript to see what they took, how well they did, and then that puts them on the pathway of which classes they take in high school, and that can make a big difference.
Sorry, another follow-up question. So this can play out double-edged sword. So if your student does well in the AP class or honor class, or the GPA goes up.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if the class is too hard for them, it will bring the GPA down.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, when they apply for college, it's not going to be as good as having taken it first in the first place.
Yeah, so that's why the hope, of course, is that, the teachers obviously come adequately prepared to help the student, as well as the students taking advantage, asking questions early on, having a good study schedule, all that good stuff to keep them on track. But I would say at the end of the day, it's more of a benefit than not, of course. So, yeah. But it's a matter of course, balancing also realistically, can your student handle 5 AP classes? Usually, no, that's a lot, right? So we want to manage expectations too. But I think if you find a perfect balance and you know what your student's comfortable with, and checking in on your child that they're okay, I think that's going to make the difference in making sure they're fine.
I think for AP class, when you take the class and you have to take this at the end.
Yes, you do. Yeah, you do. So,
If you take the class and you feel good about it, you can go and take the test.
Mhm.
If you don't feel good about it, so you don't have to take the test to really benefit from the learning.
yes, that's true.
Just failing on it or anything like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I would say though the benefit if you take AP and then you take the exam and you do well in the exam, so for instance if you get a 3, 4, or 5, ideally you want to be 4 or 5 on the score. When they go to college, that will cancel out some of the classes they have to take sometimes, which is nice. So that is another benefit of the APs, which you can't necessarily get from an honors class, because taking an honors class wouldn't cancel out a college level course.
Another question, I heard about something about accurate, I think. I'm not very clear about what
Mhm. What's it called?
accurate.
Accurate?
No, accurate.
Ah.
Bachelor.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
It is the
It's a bachelor, yeah. Just a different term.
It's international, I think.
IB, yes. So some schools offer IB. It's similar to AP. It's just, yeah, IB, yeah. It's similar to AP in terms of evaluation. Typically, though, you only see that at private schools. That's another difference. Private schools usually have these partnerships with IBs to take that, whereas public high schools only usually have APs. In terms of the difference, the IB curriculum is predefined. It's a little different. And how they're evaluated, honestly, in most cases, about the same. It's not a major difference, because the reality is the IBs typically are more from international schools. In the U.S., some schools offer it, but because of that, it's kind of just like, oh, if you took it because your school offered it, but it's not.
Not really good.
Yeah, it's not like you have to have that. I think you want APs, if anything, because that's a natural, like everyone, even playing field. Yeah.
And just a question is in terms of the APs that some schools are not offering. For example, if my daughter wants to take or something, and it's not offered in the school district that she's enrolled in. So would it be possible that she would be looking for it in any other college or any other place to take it, and it would be accredited for her?
Yes, I would probably suggest, if it fits her schedule, to take it at a community college. To take the class at a community college, because when it comes time for admission review, they're going to see. They're going to ask for all her transcripts. She's going to send those in, and they're going to see that she took those classes, and she can even write about it. So for instance, I had a student last year really interested in government and law and policy, and really interested in like social justice movement, and they didn't offer anything like that at the high school. So they took like an introduction to like sociology class at the community college, and in one more class, and they wrote about it and how they furthered their learning, and it's a good thing. It is a good thing. But again, don't feel like your student has to do it if it's not something they're genuinely interested in. I think if they're genuinely interested in and it goes along with their storyline, it makes sense. But in most cases, sometimes students are perfectly fine with their high school. I think the biggest thing is the extracurricular activities, which we'll get into in a bit. But yeah, there's a whole lot. And we also give another presentation only on college admission and like what that looks like too. So happy to come back and talk a little bit more about that too, or we can talk one-on-one after. But I'll kind of go through a little more like K through 12 stuff.
So you can be admitted to high school and college at the same time? Is that what you're saying?
You can take classes at the community college as a high school student, yes.
So you're studying for high school and then you're taking college classes?
Yeah, some students do that. You can do that, yeah. Yeah.
So what about the AA degree? So for example, some schools can offer the high school plus AA degree.
Like the dual enrollment?
Yeah.
Yeah. So some high schools do offer that. If it makes sense for your student to do it, yes. So I can give you a brief overview of like college admissions right now. It's in a very competitive state right now, but I think the one thing is you kind of want to focus on something. So I know a lot of times people tell you, oh, your child has to do all these different things, which is true, but I think the shift in perspective now is make it a little more focused. So for instance, AA degree. Let's say your student is really interested in physics. So in high school, realistically, they can only take one physics class, either regular physics or AP physics or honors physics, and that's it. It's about the same thing. But if they want to continue the dual enrollment and take more physics classes, they can do that with an AA, for instance. Not to say they have to do it, but it can go back and reinforce this whole idea of, I'm really interested in physics, I want to be a physicist, I want to study this, whatever, and I've taken advantage through taking an AA in physics. But again, they don't have to do it, but something like that would make sense. Yeah.
Because it's some I don't know, but like some schools offer it as part of the, like AOC, for example, it gives like the AA degree, they take 56 credits, so they don't choose a field, they will just take an AA degree.
So to take an AA degree, what you have to do is you have to take the general education classes, which is like the first year 2 of community college. And then you take specialized classes, though, because you can only get an AA in something, unless it's general studies, I guess, but typically you get an AA in physics, an AA in psychology, or something like that. So you're taking the general classes and then a couple of classes within that field. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so kind of going back to maybe my elementary. Yes. Oh, sure. Oh, okay. Sure, thank you. So sending your child to school ready to learn. I know most of you have older children, but just some things to kind of refresh. Make sure the student has a nutritious breakfast, has the right amount of sleep, not being on the phone or iPads too soon before going to bed, because it makes a difference in their quality of sleep. And we know that those that sleep well tend to focus better and actually just do better. They're able to absorb more information because they're refreshed. So we stress that because I think we forget that sometimes. And then, reminding them that, video games, TV, all that good stuff, I know the kids enjoy that, but just putting them on a reasonable schedule, I think, can always make a huge difference. Keeping them organized, whatever that looks like for you. So I think in some cases, sometimes it's helpful that the student pick out their clothes the night before so they're not rushing in the morning. Or making sure that they have a calendar in their room that they can see, hey, this day I have a project due. This day, homework number 10 is due, So making sure they can visualize it and see it rather than kind of being reactive and telling them, hey, your homework's due tomorrow, where is it? If they see it, that sometimes helps the student visualize, like, okay, Let me try to break it down. And these habits that you place on them will ideally turn into their habits. So that's another important thing. And I think this one's also a good one. Just sometimes having a place where they can write down any important information, because I know kids forget and they lose a lot of things, and as parents you have to take care of all that, but also putting some responsibility on the teen or your child now will also hopefully help them be a little more independent when they get older, as well as more organized. So supporting homework expectations. I know you all know that homework is very important. We know parents always stay up working with their students to ensure that they're able to complete their homework and learn it. I think one thing though that we forget sometimes is how much homework should a student have according to their grade level. So typically it's 10 minutes per grade level. So for instance, if your child's in the first grade, you should expect at least 10 minutes of homework a day, and so on and so forth as it goes up. Middle school is really when it kicks up a notch, because they're taking about 5 to 6 or 7 classes, so their homework gets a lot more intense. They have more assignments that are due. It's a lot more independent. So they're going to be spending a lot more time doing work. So again, creating those good habits of putting things on a calendar and having the student actually write it out so they know when to do things and when to expect things, rather than feeling frustrated at the end and like, oh, I have something due, and then you're staying up late with them, or they're stressed or you're stressed. These are ways in which you can kind of mitigate that stress. And then high school years, of course, this is when it becomes very critical for honors and AP classes, and planning to attend for colleges. So preparing for the SAT, ACT if needed. There are just many ways in which we want to kind of keep in mind. Any questions on that?
In regards of the exam, homeworks and exams, you've mentioned in one of the previous slides that we should be knowing what are the exam dates and stuff like that. Sometimes, for example, for my second grader, we don't know that they are having exams. And I just knew that she got her exam, and one of the school district rules that they don't share even the results in the paper itself of the exam unless we go to school and
To see.
ask for it. So
Yeah.
how can we balance that? We will be knowing when are the exams supposed to be, especially for that young.
So in a case like this, I think it's okay to email the teacher and ask them if they have a calendar that they can share with you, or if they have a syllabus of some sort. I know sometimes it's not always as planned as in advance, especially at the K through 6 level. But I think as a parent, feel free to ask. Some teachers will give it, some won't, and if they don't, sometimes it's just because they don't have it already. But I think it's perfectly fine as a parent to ask. So you have that ability. So again, getting their email, or even after school if you're able to talk to them at open house night, things like that. Even as you're going to open houses, I know open house happens in the beginning of the school year. So that's something you can ask. So as you're developing your relationships with the teachers, ask them, hey, so are you able to do this? Because this would help me and help my student. So just kind of give them those tips and ask for it. Oftentimes, if they're able to do it, they will do it. But it's one of those things you have to ask for, because if not, the teacher will not give it to you. I know, yeah.
What's the difference between the AST and the ACT?
I will get to that in a little bit. I'll touch on that, yeah. So organizational skills, this goes a really, really long way. I will say a lot of students that I've seen very successful, like even in college, they had very strong organizational skills as a child. That was really implemented and prioritized in their household. So teaching them, again, going back to that calendar, teaching them how to keep track of things, and not innate. So we say not innate because naturally we're not born knowing how to do those things. So as parents, that's something you can teach the child, and then the child will hopefully be able to kind of keep at it. So this is just more so knowing the disciplinary policies. So for instance, if your student isn't attending classes or has to miss class for whatever reason, making sure you know the appropriate steps. So for instance, does the school require you to call a day in advance or call in letting them know, hey, your student's not coming in, or do they not, right? So these are certain things that you want to be mindful of, because it can come back later where the schools are like, hey, your child missed 6 days of school this year or the last semester, and you never told us why, so they're marked as unexcused. So as a parent, try to avoid having those unexcused absences. So if, for instance, they have a doctor's appointment or they have somewhere to be, let them know so they can excuse it, because it can come back later as unexcused absences and intrudence, and you would want to avoid that. Yeah, this is just kind of the attendance that I was saying. Just let them know again that your child's not attending. And if your student doesn't want to go to school, or if your student struggles to have the urge to go to school, I think one thing I'd encourage parents is to learn a little bit more about why. I know a lot of times they just don't want to go because they'd rather stay at home. It's a little more fun. But if it's something that's consistent or persistent and they really, really have trouble going, I think you as all parents know this, but making sure that you're able to talk to your student to see if there are any issues that are happening that you need to go back and talk to the school to get a little more information. So bullying, difficult assignments, or teachers not treating them well, having a lot of issues with classmates, those are all things that, you know, as you pick up your child, I'm sure you have conversations with them, how did your day go, things like that, but really keeping in mind if there's anything that's really causing them a lot of uncomfort with their school, because that's important too. As a parent, you want to at least be proactive with that rather than reactive. Because I've seen sometimes some teachers or students just not having the greatest experiences, and unfortunately that results in the student having stress and anxiety as young as like kindergarten, second grade, and then not performing as well. So these are things that you want to keep tabs on. All right, so after school programs, oftentimes these are offered at your schools, and or you may find an outside program in which you take your school to help them develop their interests, just have someone watch them because maybe you're working full-time and you can't pick them up right after school. So if you're interested in after-school programs, I think a few things that you want to ask always is, what will the child be doing? What does the schedule look like? And what is the student-to-staff ratio? And is there time for the student to do homework? Is there time for the student to get help with their homework? Things like that I think are always really important, because those couple hours, they can get a lot done or they can get not a lot done, and then you end up picking those pieces. So something to think about if you need an after-school program. I don't think I have to go through this very deeply, but just screen time guidelines, I think as parents, and I'm sure you all do this already, but making sure that you limit the screen time for your students with the iPads, playing games, the phones, the TVs, all that good stuff, because it does truly have an effect, right? Especially if they're watching TV or around a screen very soon to bedtime, it doesn't help with their ability to sleep. So something to keep in mind too. And some things that parents can do too that I don't think some people realize is you can also limit certain websites. You can block certain websites. You can block certain times in which they can have access to things. So those are things that you can certainly take advantage of as well, especially if your student's very tech savvy, because I know they're very smart. IEP, or individualized education programs. So if you notice your student maybe has some special needs or has some learning difficulties, be sure to connect with your high school or with the school about IEP programs so they can help the student. I can't stress this enough. It's one of those things that the sooner you're able to address it, the better it is later on, rather than addressing it later on. It can make it extremely difficult for the student and even the family. So IEP is offered at every school. Okay, so this isn't just middle school, but thinking about middle school from the lens of this is the time in which they're going to prepare for high school. So what they do in middle school can and does have an effect on the classes they take in high school. So some keys to success. Number one, sleep. Can't stress that one enough. Making sure they're sleeping and they're eating well for their brains to be fully awake and alert to absorb as much information as possible. Completing homework. Of course, that'll be a habit. Hopefully we're instilling from K through 6. Getting involved. So this is the time in which now they have a little more autonomy. They can be part of associate student body. They can be part of different clubs. They're also taking different classes now, or more classes, I should say, and around different students. So as a parent, you can certainly encourage them to get involved with different programs to help them identify their interests, what they're liking, what they're not liking, because again, this is going to go back to that high school and that time in which you have to, like I mentioned, focusing in. asking for help. Parents, if something's not going right, talk to the teachers, ask for the help, and students as well. Encourage your student to tell you and be honest with you, because again, it's one of those things that we want to be proactive rather than reactive to ensure their success. And then staying organized, can't stress that one enough. And then making SMART goals if that's helpful. So SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely, or time-based. So if a student's having difficulty, for instance, completing tasks, sometimes breaking it down is a lot more helpful. So let's say they have one big book project. There's several steps that go into it. Reading the book, analyzing the book, writing a page or two about certain topics, answering different questions. If you break down the gigantic project into little pieces, students oftentimes are a little more receptive to that and they don't feel overwhelmed. So sometimes something as simple as that, helping them do that and like, okay, step 1, we have to do this, check it off. Step 2, doing this, checking it off. Rather than saying, hey, you have a book project due in a week. Get started. What are you doing, right? So making those small measurable goals, keeping them organized, I think will help them go a long way. Okay, so extracurricular activities. This is essentially any activity they participate in outside of the classroom. So it could be associated with their school, it could be associated with the church, it could be associated within their community, jobs, internships, whatever that looks like. Now, the reason why we stress it as early on as middle school is because, again, going back to them solidifying their interests and honing in on them in high school. So for instance, if your student really likes Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts and leadership, maybe they might want to be part of associated student body, and then that can turn into something they do in high school and how they, initiate different clubs and take advantage and kind of serve as a leader in their high school. But having them participate is really important because without it, they won't know whether or not they like it. Computer science or coding, for instance. If a student likes to code, they can certainly get involved as early as middle school or even elementary school in some cases. And if they really like it, I know I had a student, for instance, he really liked to code. He learned how to code like middle school, early high school. By the time he graduated high school, he had created an app because he really knew he liked that early on. And he was able to take more initiative and do more rather than being told, hey, you should take this computer science class. He had already done that work before. And this is where, as parents, identifying different things that are around you. Some things are going to be free. In some cases, some things may cost money. But really being strategic and helping them identify those interests. And if they really hate something too, I think after 6 months, if they really, really hate it, it's okay to maybe go somewhere else or try something different. You don't have to force them to do something because, again, we want them to identify what they like so they take more initiative naturally. Because I will say with that student, his parents did not tell him to create an app. He did it himself because he really liked it. So just repeating what I said, identifying them, matching them with corresponding skills or activities, and then letting them stay involved in many, many ways because they'll grow that way. So why are they so important for college? So this is where it gets really important. As some of you may know, colleges, these last couple years, especially because of COVID, they've completely done away with the SAT or ACT. So with that being said, colleges have one less factor to evaluate students. So now we're looking at other things that make the students stand out. So their grades are one thing. Their experiences are another. Extracurriculars is another key important piece because that tells us a lot about who the student is. So for instance, I had a student, she was very impressive during COVID. What she did was she got a couple of her friends and they started to bake little treats and then drop them off to senior homes during COVID because people couldn't go out at the time. And they wrote little notes, little like affirmations, positive notes. And that was really impressive to us because then what she did was she managed to get money from different local stores who donated money for them to keep creating those, they called it sweets for seniors. It was very cute. But that was a lot. For us, we saw it as leadership, initiative. She cares for other people. She was creative about it, right? There's so many things that come out of that. But again, this is where we stress where it's so important because she did not take the SAT or ACT. And she got into really good schools. Obviously, she had a lot of other things going for her, but that was one thing that really stood out for us. Another student that I had who I think got a full ride to Harvard, but he did a lot. He published a book. So I know it sounds a little crazy, but he was really interested in economics. He learned about economics in high school and started even learning about it like in middle school, because he realized, he's like, what does, supply and demand mean? Something so simple. So what he did was he wrote a book for kindergartners, actually. So it was only like 10 pages at best. And he designed it and wrote about it, but basically how to explain economics to a kindergartner. And then he went around to his local school districts and said, hey, I have this book, do you want to purchase it? All the school districts purchased it. And then now it's actually, I think, the #1 best-selling book on Amazon for economics for kids. So those are like certain things that really stand out. And it goes beyond them even being in their classroom or them being part of, like a Kids Helping Kids Club on campus. Like those are the types of things we want to see now. So this is why I say, if they like something, let them run with it. They will be creative. Nobody told him to create a book. Nobody told her to create that Sweets for Seniors. It wasn't their parents telling them, it was rather them taking initiative. So what makes an extracurricular activity stand out? The 3 things we're always looking for: leadership, passion, impact. So leadership. You don't have to be a leader. You don't have to be like the president of a club or the vice president of a club to be a leader. To me, a leader is that student who took initiative to create that book, that student that took the initiative to create the Sweets for Seniors, that student that took the initiative to create the app, right? They did it themselves. So that's where they learn those leadership skills, and that's why those activities or extracurricular activities become important in middle school, because they transcend into high school. And then passion. Passion is something that comes within. You have to really enjoy it. You have to really like it. So this is why I stress for parents, try to help them find what they like and encourage them to explore it further. Challenge them to do something else with it. Don't just tell them what to do, but think about it. So what do you want to solve? What do you wish you could do? If you could be anything in the world, what would you do and why? Those little questions, they're very telling for students because they will get very creative with the responses. And once you kind of have that information, you can help guide them any one way. And then lastly, impact. So impact comes in many, many ways. So for instance, the Sweets for Seniors impact was putting a smile on a senior citizen's face when they couldn't see anyone. The app impact was for people to have accessibility, and the app was to create, basically, every time he go play basketball at the park, the courts were full. So he created an app where they can track when a basketball court is free or full. So that's an impact that he had on his community, because now other students that wanted to use the basketball court could just go use it. And then the book impact, huge impact, because now we're teaching economics to kindergartners. I know I personally didn't learn about economics till high school, so that's very, very impressive. So here are some sample extracurricular activities. And they fall within different domains: the arts, business, culture, community involvement, academic clubs. So again, a lot of them will be found on their high school, but also others can be found in which they create. So web design, peer tutoring, entrepreneurship club, things like that, ceramics. Here are a few others: government, media, performing arts, religious groups. There's so many different things they can get involved in. So just encouraging them to find those and learn about those. And even simple conversations with other parents at the high school or the middle school, asking them, oh, what activities is your student involved in? I think that's also really telling sometimes, because we kind of have an idea of what activities are out there, but you'd be surprised to know how many more else are out there. And oftentimes that comes with talking to other people. So ways to get involved, many, many ways. Student council, hobbies, clubs, athletics, family business, church, Girl and Boy Scouts. There's so many, many ways they can get involved. So just some things to think about here. And like, for instance, I had a student too, I think this one was interesting, church. So her involvement in helping the homeless started from the church. Because we tend to have numerous opportunities within the church to go help the homeless, but she also took it up another level, and something similar to the Sweets for Seniors, she started to package little like healthcare packs, because she's very passionate about healthcare, for homeless people, and she would drop it off with her friends. She created a club on her high school campus doing that, but that stemmed from her learning about and being exposed to homeless people through the church by going and donating. But she realized, she's like, me going and donating one time is not enough. So she wanted to have more of an impact. So you see these little experiences, you'd be surprised. The students get very creative. But anyway, all that is to say that they should be involved in different ways, not just in one way. So encourage them to be involved in many different things if possible. All right, so preparing your child for college, which I think is the one everyone's interested in. So there's a 4-year timeline from 9th through 12th grade. So 9th grade, the main focus with 9th grade is, as parents, try to meet with your students' counselor. Get to know them, get to know what's offered at the high school, so you know how on track your student is and what they're taking. Learn about the A through G guide, which again, you can ask the college counselor for. A through G guide essentially is just the classes that they need to take in order to be eligible to go to a Cal State or a UC, and usually private universities as well. Exploring extracurricular activities and involvement. So 9th grade is really the time I would encourage students to check out all the different clubs. Go attend 8 different clubs, and then by 10th grade, what we want them to do is start to narrow those clubs down. They're probably not super interested in all 8, but it was good for them to be exposed to different clubs. So maybe narrowing it down to 3, 4 clubs, or however many they really want to be invested in. But 10th grade now is when our grades really begin to matter. So 9th grade, because it is a transitionary period, I will say colleges are very lenient or tend to be more lenient if 9th grade they didn't have the best grades. Because it's a big transition from middle school to high school. But by 10th grade, colleges do kind of assume or expect that you've gone into the groove of things and are now doing better academically. So you can begin honors as soon as 9th grade, of course, but if you haven't taken any honors or AP classes, 10th grade is the time that we want them to start doing that. And then continue their involvement, study for the SAT or ACT if they need to take it, and start exploring college campuses, because I will say a lot of research shows that if you take a student to a college campus, they're more likely to aspire to try to go to that school. So for instance, if you take your student to, I don't know, Berkeley, you're visiting San Francisco, you take a stop at UC Berkeley, if a student sees a campus, there's a lot of research that shows that they get kind of excited about it and they kind of strive for it more. So they put their mind to it that I want to get there, or I want to get to something similar, and you'd be surprised what it does for students. 11th grade, taking on academic challenges, meaning taking more classes, more rigorous classes. Pursuing leadership opportunities. Again, leadership does not have to be in the form of a title, it's more so in the form of initiative. So if, again, going back to what those students did in their high schools as extracurriculars, those are leadership activities. They weren't necessarily the club event, the president of anything, but they took on something. Taking exams if needed. Exams mean the SAT or ACT. Start to write your college essay, touring the campuses, and then confirming A through G. And this is something they'll confirm with their college counselor to ensure that they're taking all the classes and or have all the classes on track to graduate and to be eligible for college. 12th grade is when they start to apply, and then obviously continuing to do well, meet provisions of admission. This essentially means that some universities will say, you're admitted, but you're only admitted until you get, at minimum, you have to get a B in your Calculus 1 class. If they fall below the B, admission's rescinded. So there are provisions in some cases. File for FAFSA and then applying for scholarships. So this is the A through G requirements. Again, the college counselor can go through it with them, but essentially 2 years of history, science, social science, 4 years of English, 3 years of math. So this is a good example here where minimum you need 3 years of math. Realistically, if you want to be competitive and take on a challenge, taking 4 years of math. 2 years of laboratory science. If your student's really interested in applying like as a biology major, maybe taking 3 years of science instead of 2, because again, making them more competitive. 2 years of another language other than English, and then 1 year of visual and performing arts. And again, making sure as soon as freshman year that the college counselors have them on track to complete these classes. And these classes can also come in the form of APs and honors too. So pathways to college, there are really 3 routes a student can go to college. So the traditional route is graduating as a senior in high school and going straight to a 4-year university. And the other two routes is, in some cases, some students take what's called a California High School Exit Exam, or CHSP. And they typically take this after the 10th grade going into the 11th grade. And if they pass the exam, which only tests them on 9th and 10th grade knowledge, they graduate from high school. They've completed high school. They don't have to continue going to high school. But they can't go to a 4-year community college because they haven't completed all the classes to be eligible, or the A through G requirements. So what they can do is they can go to a community college and then transfer to a 4-year university. And the other option, of course, is finish as a senior in high school, then go to community college, then transfer to the 4-year university. So those are the three main routes. And then within our 4-year colleges, we have publics and privates. So publics, as you may all know, the Cal State system, the UC system. And then private schools are things like Stanford, Pomona College, USC, and then Ivy Leagues, which are also private schools, like Harvard, Princeton.
What's the benefit of the exam at 10th grade if you still going to go to the community college and then the 4 years?
That's a good question. So with that exam, it's in my opinion, it's case by case. I don't think every student should do it. I think certain students, it makes sense, but you have to be mindful of, is your child ready? Let's say they're a 10th grader in high school. They pass the exam. They go to community college. They're about 16 years old. And they're going to a community college with people, the ages ranges, 18 to like 50, right? Are they mature enough to be in those classes, to do group projects, and to succeed? Because that's the other thing you have to be mindful of. Is a 16-year-old truly well-equipped to, in college, no one tells you, hey, your homework's due. Hey, you have to come to class. It's up to them. If they don't want to come to class, if they don't want to do homework, the teacher does not care. So if your student is not emotionally mature, mentally mature enough to take that on, I'm always very hesitant in most cases. Don't get me wrong, there are some students that have their reasons, maybe like constant bullying, or they are very mature, or they are a little more advanced. It may make sense for them, but in most cases, sometimes it doesn't. And just to add to that, I've also seen students who take the CHSP exam thinking, oh, I'm going to save 2 years of community college, or I'm going to save 2 years to graduate early, so I can go to medical school earlier. The issue with that sometimes is, in some cases, as they're adjusting, as a 16-year-old going to community college, they don't do so well, because it's a shock to them. And guess what? GPA isn't high. And now colleges are only looking at your community college GPA. They're not looking at the high school GPA. So if they're already kind of setting themselves up on a rocky start, that also doesn't help them get as far as they thought it would. So if anyone wanted to talk more individually about their student, I'm happy to kind of have that one-on-one conversation, because I don't think it's for everyone, but it is for some people. But you just kind of have to evaluate those things. Yeah.
Sorry, what is because you have another arrow from high school to community college. Some people say it's way better to go from high school to 4-year college versus going to community college. I know that there is some pros and cons financially, but if there is any pros and cons, let's say, in the opportunity to go to university.
Yeah, so I think one big thing is, so costs, yeah, you're right. Huge difference. One reason why I might encourage a 4-year university straight out of high school, especially if they get into a school that they actually want to go to, is because they're going to have 4 years of experience within a college. So 4 years to be able to engage in, for instance, research opportunities, working alongside with professors on certain opportunities that aren't necessarily offered at the community college. Because a community college is very much a kind of a one-stop, you're just taking your classes, you're moving on. And even the professors at a community college, they're not engaged in research. They're not as engaged in the development of a student, whereas a 4-year university professor is, because a lot of their assessment relies on that. So I'll give an example here. Medical school. Say your child wants to go to medical school. Medical school really likes when students have research experience. But guess what? At a 4-year university, you have opportunities to do research. If you transfer as a junior, you only have 2 years at the 4-year university. But the first year, half the time, they're trying to figure out what is what. They don't have the relationships. They don't know anyone. They haven't met those professors. Now they're kind of starting from scratch. So at best, sometimes they may not get an opportunity until their senior year. So that's 1 year of experience. Versus a student maybe who secured that sophomore year. They have 3 years of research experience. That's a big difference. So those are kind of the things you're paying for. You're paying more for the experiences that they get access to versus at the community college you're saving, but you're also losing out on some of the experiences. So again, bringing it back down to, I think the biggest question is the school worth it at the end of the day? Like if they got into a great 4-year university, I think they should go. If they got into like their bottom tier 4-year university, they don't want to go, and they have the drive to achieve a little better and go to a different school, I think they could go to a community college. But those are one of the big differences. And also even like medical school, for instance, just because I know a lot of students are interested in it, the first couple of years are taking the required classes for medical school. General biology, general chemistry, calculus, all that stuff. I will say some medical schools give preference to students that have taken those classes at a 4-year university because they see it as more challenging than if they took it at a community college. So that's another added benefit. But it's not to say it's for everyone because some students don't want to go to medical school, and then in which case they don't need it. So just some things to think about. So here's a little more about the trust fee to just add to that. Here's some just exam information. Has to be at least 16. The cost depends on if you enroll early or if you enroll late. It's offered only 3 times a year, and all they're going to test them on is English and math. That's it. So basically, as long as you finish 2 years of high school, you should be able to pass this exam easy. The pros, like I kind of mentioned, you can transfer, you can graduate early, you can technically work because you're no longer a high school student, and they don't require a worker's permit if that's something they're looking for. The cons, limited college options, maturity, academic performance, lack of resources, missing out on some experience as a high school student, and thinking of those long-term impacts and how that influences it. So again, happy to talk more one-on-one if you have a student situation. All right, so college admission requirements, academic qualities, A through G classes, and their grades. So I will say A through G does not include, for instance, PE. So PE, let's say your student's getting an A in PE, that gets pulled out of their GPA. So something to keep in mind. SAT, ACT scores, UCs and Cal States are not requiring it, but some private schools are now bringing it back. And we do expect this year a handful of them to bring it back. So if you ask, should my student take it or not take it, I think it depends on their goals. If they're only looking to go to a public school, it's fine to not invest in that. But if they're thinking about private schools like Stanford, USC, things like that, it would be worth the investment. The SAT, ACT, yeah. And they only have to take one of them. They do not have to take both of them to be eligible. Any questions? Yes.
My question is related more to from middle school to high school.
Uh-huh.
So when we try to make a decision which high school my child will go to, what are the factors that we should be considering for each school to make that decision?
So you can look up what's called the school profile for each high school, and the school profile will list all the information. How many AP classes a high school offers, the percentage of their students going to a 4-year university, what universities they've been admitted to, the student-teacher ratio, the extracurricular opportunities offered at that high school. It basically gives you everything in one document. So I would look at that and to see if it meets the needs and the goals of your student. And you could also, of course, call the school or even look at the school website. I will say now school websites have a lot of information than before, so you could kind of look through that a little more heavily. But one thing that you also want to ask them is access to like the middle school transcript, because oftentimes they evaluate the transcript to make a decision in terms of what classes they should be taking. So if it's within the district, you don't have to worry about that. They already have that information. If it's outside of the district that they're in right now, you may have to prepare to send that information to them. So that's just something to keep in mind too, and how they evaluate it, because every school district can be a little different.
And so what public information like on the website?
Yeah, it should be. Usually sometimes you can Google the name of the school and then school profile. And then in some cases, they'll like list it. I know I've seen a lot of high school websites now. They have like little tabs at the top, and you have to hover over some of them, and then it'll list it down there. So sometimes it's a little hidden. Okay, so for personal qualities for a college application, which is now kind of what we're relying a little more heavily on, personal statement. the extracurricular activities, and then in some cases, some schools are going to require letters of recommendation, which should come from either a teacher or a college counselor, and then an interview or resume. Very few schools will require this, but if they do, that's something to consider as well. And for personal statements, if you have any students in high school, I would say if your child is about to be a senior this coming year, they should start thinking about their responses now. And we're happy to help them with that, and we do like personal statement workshops as well, or we can meet with them one-on-one to kind of, I guess you could say, be strategic about it, because I think this is the piece that students forget how important it is. And yeah, happy to help them strategize, because it's a very fine balance of making a very, very good one or making one that's just mediocre, and that makes a huge difference in admissions as well. So types of colleges, public versus private, kind of touched on this. So just a little bit more about each system. We have the California State University, so like Cal State Northridge, Cal State Long Beach, Cal State Fullerton, Cal State LA. So this is the largest public four-year university system in the nation, and they are located in larger and smaller cities. So there are 23 campuses throughout the state of California, and the average tuition is about $6,000-7,000 per year. And I will say with the Cal States, and the same with the UCs too, they have designated areas in which they prioritize students. So I think Simi Valley, Cal State Northridge prioritizes students within this area. So I will say, and what that means essentially is that a good portion, at least 10% or 15% of the students they admit must be from within this area. So that's why oftentimes you may see a lot of students being admitted, because they prioritize certain areas. So for instance, like the Long Beach area will prioritize like Long Beach, San Diego prioritizes like a San Diego region, things like that. So just something to know. For the UCs, it's a public university system that is known for its academics, its research, and its selectivity. It's a little more selective in some cases, located in larger cities, 9 campuses throughout the state of California, the closest one obviously being UCLA. And average tuition is about, I think it's about $15,000 now. So within the UCs, I will say you tend to see a lot of students moving away to college because there's so few of them. Whereas the Cal States tend to be more commuter schools, meaning maybe a student lives at home and then commutes to school. And here's just a quick comparison between the two. Lower cost of tuition at the UC and the Cal States, much, much higher at the private. So for instance, I think USC right now is about $62,000. So huge difference in terms of the cost per year. But with Cal States and UCs, they have smaller endowments, so there's less opportunity for scholarships or grant money. Whereas at the privates, they have people that donate millions of dollars a year, and those millions of dollars get produced into scholarships. So you may find more and more students being admitted for a full ride at a private school than you ever will here at a public school. And again, because they're privates, they can do whatever they want with their money, whereas public schools are bound to the state and how they allocate their funds. So in some cases, not all, a private school can be cheaper than a public school. I've definitely seen it happen in many cases. I know students who, after getting their scholarship money for a private school and getting their financial aid packet for a public school, the private school is a little cheaper sometimes. So, and I say that just because don't limit your student in terms of where they should apply, because you never know what they might get. Despite the cost difference, I know it's massive. So public schools, they have more major and minor opportunities, and that's because they're just much larger schools, whereas the privates tend to be a little more focused in most cases, so they have less majors and less minors. Class size is a huge difference. The UCs, for instance, you may be in a class with 300 other people. At a private school, you're probably just in a class with like 20 people, sometimes as small as like 15. Diversity. So Cal State UCs have more in-state diversity, and that's because a huge portion of the students admitted to the public schools must be residents of the state of California. Private schools are a lot more diverse. You'll see students from Minnesota, New York, Ohio, different states, because again, not bound by the state, they can admit who they want from wherever they want. So you'll see more nationwide and international diversity at a private school. Public schools, not religiously affiliated. Some private schools are. And then in terms of graduation rates, I would take that with a grain of salt. They all typically graduate. The only thing that you might hear is, like, for instance, engineering nowadays takes about 5 years instead of 4. And we see that a lot at the public schools because the classes get impacted. So sometimes their time of graduation is delayed a year. And that's essentially what that means. But it's not to say they don't graduate. They do. It just might be delayed. Any questions on any of that? Yeah.
I just have a question. Does the IEP affect the chances of a student being admitted to certain colleges?
No, not at all. That should have no impact on them. I think what it comes down to is the student figuring out, though, what school is a good fit for them. What school will have the resources for them to succeed once they're there, which honestly most schools are very well equipped to take on students, but that's something that I would look into. I know, like, actually, for instance, UC Berkeley just graduated 2 students that were blind and autistic, and they just graduated from UC Berkeley, so has no impact on any of that. Any other questions? So community colleges, there are 115 of them located throughout the state of California. Open admission, meaning anyone can apply, anyone will be admitted. And students, once they reach about 60 units, they can apply to transfer to a 4-year university. And a lot of them do partner up with UCs, Cal States, and even some local private schools to have transfer options for them. And then for the UCs, it's called 7-course pattern. CSU, it's called Golden 4. This essentially means the classes they need to take in order to be eligible for transfer. It's not listed here, but I'll mention it. There's something that's called TAG, or the transfer agreement, which essentially means that for students going to community college, if they meet a certain number of classes, a certain GPA, they can apply for TAG with 1 UC, which means guaranteed admission to 1 UC. The only caveat is UC San Diego, UC Berkeley, and UCLA do not participate in this, but all the other UCs do. So you can guarantee yourself admission to a UC if you complete the courses and the certain GPA. So that's something that could be a benefit at the community college. So going back down to if you have the drive and the emotional, like, intelligence to kind of go through it, you can get there. And if your child goes to community college, just a tip, not the guaranteed way into, like, UC Berkeley or UCLA or San Diego, but they do give priority to students that are part of the honors club. So that's something I'd encourage. If your student goes the community college path, encourage them as soon as they start to be part of the honors program, because they do look first at those students. All right, so some tips to support college students, stay connected with them, of course, checking in with them. I know in some cases students live with their parents. In other cases, students may move away for college, and that's okay. But just being knowledgeable of, like, the campus resources and ensuring that your student's taking advantage of them. Encourage them to have a growth mindset and trust your student. I can't stress this one enough. I know we want our kids near us, but sometimes the best option is for them to go away for college. And I just stress this because I have a lot of conversations with parents about, I want him to be near me, so I don't want him to apply to UCLA or UC Berkeley when he's very much would get accepted there. And I've had many conversations with parents where don't limit your child because it can make a big difference in their long-term career routes. So I think of that one parent because she wanted him to go to, like, Cal State San Bernardino or UC Riverside to be near her home, but he did get admitted to UCLA. We had a long conversation. She let him go, thank God, but a lot of it was, again, thinking about, let's say your student wants to go to medical school or law school. Where they go to undergrad also has a huge impact on that. So I know you want to be close to them, but don't limit them. And encourage them to apply to different schools, even out-of-state schools, because you never know. I know we had one student within the community, too. He managed to get into, I think it was Princeton or Yale, but he applied, but a big fight with his parents to apply because they didn't want him to go out of state. Managed to get a full ride, and that's the best decision he ever made. So you never know. I would just say encourage them. Any questions on that before I go into, like, brief financial aid?
I still don't
Yeah.
see the difference between AST and
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought it was going to be in here, but it's not. So quick difference is ACT is going to test on math, English, science, whereas the SAT will only test basically on English and math. So there's going to be the science on the ACT. A key difference between the two is the ACT is basically just testing them on everything they've learned in high school, and is very straightforward. The questions are very straightforward. You know, very, very simple. Not simple, but very straightforward questions, whereas the SAT requires them to think a little more critically about a question. It's not going to be, hey, here's a problem, solve it. It's going to give you a story. It's going to go a little more intricate and require you to think strategically to get to an answer. So this is why sometimes we see that SAT is a little more difficult than the ACT. I think what I've typically seen, though, is students that do well on one exam tend to do well on the other, but it's a matter of what the student does better in. Or actually, I'm sorry, let me take that back. Students that do well in the SAT pretty much do pretty well in the ACT, but sometimes there are some students that do very well in the ACT but don't do very well in the SAT because of the questions. So there's like PSAT, little exams they can take to see where they're doing better, and then you can identify which one to take. But again, they don't have to take both. They can take both if they want, but it's not necessary.
That's going to be my question. Can they take both and the higher grade that they get from college?
The thing is, if they take both and they have reportable scores, the schools will know about them. So it's one thing to study for them separately and prepare. It's another thing to commit to one and actually take it and submit those scores.
But the college will prepare one over the other, or both are equal?
So I will say this. In the past, I've noticed that really, really selective colleges prefer the SAT. But in more recent years, I've been noticing some schools are open to both. They kind of evaluate them similarly. So you don't have to force your students to take the SAT, but if you had to choose one, because that's the other thing, only choose one and study for that one. Because if you're trying to study for two different exams, two different ways of thinking, and they already have a bunch of classes and extracurriculars they have to worry about, they can struggle a little. So that's why I say choose one. But if I were to choose one, I would probably choose the SAT.
And if for any reason, if you take PST this year and you don't do well, then you repeat it later on, maybe and do the higher grade?
Yeah, of course. And then also the good thing about the PST, it's just like a check. You know, where are they right now? What do they need to improve on? And then you can start to kind of build off that and take more focus on the areas that they need help with. Because I know sometimes some students who do very well in math, they do very poorly on English, or vice versa. So that's the other thing. Oh, and then, I'm sorry, the third piece for each of the exams is going to be a writing portion as well. It is optional, but I would encourage it. Mm-hmm. Any other questions about college, anything like that? Okay, so financial aid, I'm going to do a very, very high-level overview of it. So here are some fees, registration fees and tuition. So community college obviously is the cheapest. Private schools are obviously the most expensive. Books and supplies will vary. Room and board, also a big cost. So, you know, community college typically students are paying for anything, they're living at home. If they're moving out of the house for college, you're paying about $14,000 a year for living expenses. And then transportation, personal expenses, obviously that varies, but the total, there's a big difference. Starting at the community college, save a lot of money versus going to a private school. But again, there is financial aid in many cases that will bring down these costs significantly. So your cost of attendance is the total cost of the school, and then you'll apply for FAFSA or financial aid, and they will determine an EFC, or an expected family contribution number, of how much you as a family can contribute to their education. They'll subtract that, and then they'll determine the need. You know, can you give a lot to your student? Do you have enough to give to your student? In which case, maybe no eligibility for financial aid. If you can't give a whole lot, then they may get the maximum eligibility, which is essentially money from the government or scholarship money to pay for the school. So there are 4 forms of financial aid. There are scholarships, grants, federal loans, and work study. So grants is always the first one that you're going to exhaust. That's from the government or the state. They'll determine how much money you need, if any. In some cases, I've seen students get full rides. I've seen other cases where students get nothing from the state because their family is sufficient enough to pay for that. Secondly, there's scholarships. And grants also do not have to be repaid. This is money that you get, and it's yours. You do not have to repay. Scholarships, you typically have to apply for this, and this will be either merit-based or performance-based. Some will be based off income. There are many different things that qualify for a scholarship, but if you receive this money, you do not have to repay. And then work study. When your student gets a financial aid like checklist, they'll say if they're eligible for a work study, and if so, how much. And basically they can get a job on campus and they'll get paid, and then that money can go back into their tuition, or they can pay out the student, which they can use towards tuition and other things. So they're working for that money. And then lastly, federal loans. So this is the one you have to repay. This is the one we try to avoid as much as possible. There may be some low interest rates, but they do have to be repaid. I will say for undergrad right now, I think it's about 4%. But basically, you take out the loans. If you are going to take out loans, as a family, you could sit down and talk about how much do they actually need to take out, because just because they're offered $50,000 of loans doesn't mean they need $50,000 in loans. If they only need 5, just take out 5 for the year and really evaluate it year by year. Because at the end of it, of course, they're going to get 6 months after they graduate. They don't have to repay, but after those 6 months, the interest is going to start 4%. So it does add up. So that's why I try to get as many scholarships as possible. Like I said, CEF has 2, so if you know anyone that needs a scholarship, we encourage them to apply. And if you want to talk more about loans separately, happy to talk about that as well, because there's like subsidized, unsubsidized, there's different types. Okay, that's all I have today. So my contact information is here if you want to take my phone number. My email, I have a different email, so it's catherine@copticedu.org. But I'm happy to share that with anyone. And then there's Sandy's information as well, so feel free to either speak with me or Sandy. Yes. So did you sign in? No, you walked in a little late. So actually, what I'm going to have is, if you didn't sign in, to sign in, and then I will email you the presentation. I don't know. One can hope, I guess. Because, with graduate school loans, like medical school, law school, master's, the minute they take out a loan, it accrues interest. So it's a lot. Whereas with undergrad, one can hope, but we'll see. So if you didn't sign in, if you could just scan the QR code, you may have to come a little closer and just sign in, and I can get your information there. But any questions? Yes?
So as Egyptians, we sometimes don't see that as one of the options. So there's white, there's Hispanic, or there's other. If there's a quota, or they have to meet certain guidelines for a specific ethnicity, is there an advantage or a strategic way that perhaps if you chose this option, white versus other, that you get in?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the real question I hear oftentimes is, do I black or African American or white or Caucasian? There's been numerous talks with the schools to incorporate a Middle Eastern or North African option, because that's truly where we fall. I know, my understanding, my parents tell me when they came here, they told them to say you're Caucasian, right? You're not African. So it's tough. I can't say what you should choose, because I also recognize that as Egyptians, we all look very different too. There's some that are a little more tan that they may label themselves as such, or maybe mixed. But to that end, if you want to be strategic, I would probably still list Caucasian, at least for me, but you can incorporate who you are in your personal statements. So that's one thing I always encourage students to do, especially with one of the questions for the UCs, is talking about your Egyptian, your Coptic identity, and having to navigate that and being more open to different ideas and perspectives, because you've kind of been situated in a place where, you have to be that person, right? So that's a way in which I'd incorporate that, rather than them having just checking you off as white, because it's way more than that. And I know we're just kind of in this middle place where no one really knows what to choose. But yeah, I can't say what to choose, because again, I know everyone looks a little different, but there's a way you could strategically incorporate it so they know kind of your background, because I think that's important, and that is something that at the end of the day, as Egyptians, we are a minoritized population, but you have to tell them sometimes. Yeah.
Does it give freedom
In some cases, yes, but if we don't know that, we don't know that. You'll get written off as Caucasian if you don't share that sometimes, and that's why I encourage students to share it.
So it's other and then commensurate.
You could put other. I don't know if they've added a box where you can insert what you are. Again, there have been numerous talks with them about changing that, but yeah, I think it's just talking about it because I do think it gives a different advantage. Yeah. Any other questions? We're good? Okay. All right, well, thank you. If you do have any other questions, again, my email is catherine@copticedu.org. I'm happy to connect with you later if anything, or I can give my phone number and we can connect that way as well. Thank you so much.